I heard my daughter-in-law say, "It feels like I married the whole family," while standing just a few feet away in the dark. And in that moment, something inside me quietly broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changes how you see everything after. It was not just the words. It was the realization that my life, my choices, even my future were being discussed without me. And what I discovered next made it clear. I was no longer part of my own story. I was being managed. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am 68 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of woman people relied on when things needed to be done properly. Numbers made sense to me in a way people sometimes did not. I spent over 30 years working as a chief accountant in Chicago, balancing books, managing risk, and making sure nothing slipped through unnoticed. It was a quiet kind of power, but it was mine. After my husband passed away, I remained in our house in Naperville. It was not large, but it was entirely paid off, and every corner of it held a memory I had chosen to keep. The kitchen window faced east, catching the morning light just right. The floors creaked in familiar places. I knew the rhythm of that house the way one knows their own breathing. Living alone never frightened me. It felt like a continuation of the life I had built, just quieter. The stroke came on a Tuesday morning. It was mild, the doctor said. I kept my speech, my memory, my sense of who I was. Still, it was enough to worry my son. Ethan called 3 times that week, his voice tight with concern, in a way I had not heard since he was a boy. He insisted I should not be alone, that it made no sense anymore. He said it gently, but there was a firmness underneath it that told me he had already made up his mind. Ethan lives in Austin, Texas, with his wife, Lauren, and their daughter, Sophie. He works long hours, always chasing something just out of reach. He has a good heart, but he often moves through life as if he is slightly behind it, catching up where he can. Lauren, on the other hand, is the opposite. She is precise, controlled, and successful in real estate. Her world is built on presentation, order, and the careful management of appearances. I agreed to move in with them, telling myself it was temporary, just until I felt steady again. That was the phrase I used. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something I could control. Their house in Austin was beautiful in a way that felt deliberate. Clean lines, neutral colors, everything arranged as if it belonged in a magazine. When I arrived, I noticed immediately how little space there was for anything unexpected. It was not unwelcoming, exactly, but it was not mine. I tried to make myself small. I kept my belongings contained to one room. I folded my clothes carefully, stacked my books neatly, and avoided leaving anything out of place. I helped where I could, cooking meals, wiping counters, staying useful. I paid attention to their routines and adjusted myself around them. Sophie barely acknowledged me. At 13, she existed in a world that did not include grandmothers. She passed by me like I was part of the furniture, not unkind, just uninterested. What I noticed most was the way I was spoken about. Not to, but about. Small things at first. Mom prefers her tea this way. She usually wakes up early. I would be standing in the same room, and still I felt slightly outside the conversation, as if I had already been accounted for. I told myself it was nothing. Families adjust. People take time to settle. I repeated that thought often, like a line I needed to believe in order to stay comfortable. This was temporary. I just needed time. But even then, somewhere beneath that reassurance, something quieter was beginning to shift. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something isn't quite right in this situation, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. I woke up sometime after 10 that night, not because of pain or discomfort, but because the house had a certain kind of silence that did not feel entirely at rest. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of yourself within it. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, then decided I would go downstairs for a glass of water. The hallway was dim, lit only by a soft glow from the kitchen below. I moved carefully, more out of habit than necessity. Over the past weeks, I had learned which steps creaked, which doors needed a lighter touch. It was not something anyone had told me. It was something I had adjusted to on my own. The kitchen lights were not fully on, just the under-cabinet fixtures Lauren always left glowing. They cast a low, even light across the counters, making everything look deliberate and still. I reached the edge of the room and stopped when I noticed the back patio door was slightly open. At first, I did not think much of it. Then I heard her voice. Lauren was outside speaking on the phone. Her tone was familiar, controlled, but carrying a strain I had not heard directed at me before. I recognized the rhythm before I made out the words. It was the voice she used when she was being honest, in a way she did not allow herself to be inside the house. I should have turned back then. That would have been the proper thing to do. Instead, I stood there, one hand resting lightly against the counter, listening without meaning to listen. It feels like I married the whole family. The sentence landed quietly, almost casually, but it settled into the room with a weight that did not move. I did not react right away. My body remained still, as if it had decided before I could that movement would only make the moment more real. She continued speaking, her voice lowering slightly. I mean, she is always there. Every morning, every night. It is like there is no space that is just ours. There was a pause, and I imagined whoever was on the other end responding in sympathy. I feel bad sometimes, I do. But we did not plan for this. Ethan will not say anything. He never does. He just lets it happen. I kept my breathing even. It was not anger I felt. Not yet. It was something slower, something colder. Recognition, perhaps. As if a thought I had been circling for weeks had finally found its shape. She does things, like cooking and cleaning, and I know it is supposed to help, but it just makes it worse somehow. Like I'm expected to be grateful for something I never asked for. My fingers tightened slightly against the counter, though I did not realize it until later. I understood then that this was not about one moment or one irritation. It was a collection of small discomforts that had been allowed to grow. I turned before she finished. Quietly, without making a sound, I walked back up the stairs. I did not take the water. I did not look back toward the kitchen. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence return around me. The house felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I had overlooked before. The way conversations shifted when I entered a room. The way decisions were made without including me, even when they concerned me. Small adjustments, subtle but consistent. A few days later, Ethan mentioned that it might be helpful if I shared more details about my finances, just so they could plan ahead. He said it casually, as if it were a practical suggestion, nothing more. I nodded at the time, but something in the phrasing stayed with me. That night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling again, the same way I had before. Only now the thought that formed was clearer, more defined. Something was not right. If that moment made you feel the shift happening beneath the surface, comment number 2 below so I know you caught it. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. In the days after that night on the patio, I found myself moving through the house differently. Not slower, not quieter, but more aware. It was as if something inside me had adjusted its focus, bringing certain details into sharper clarity. Things I might have dismissed before now held their shape a little longer. I noticed how conversation shifted when I entered a room. Not abruptly, but just enough to leave me aware that I had stepped into something already in motion. I noticed how Lauren would reorganize the kitchen after I used it, not correcting me, but restoring it to a version that did not include me. I noticed how Ethan had begun to speak around certain topics, his sentences trailing off when they neared anything that might require my input. None of it was obvious on its own. That was what made it so easy to overlook. But together, they formed a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. That afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. Lauren had gone out to meet a client. Sophie was still at school, and Ethan was working from home. I had been reading in my room when I realized I needed a notepad. It was a simple enough thing. I remembered seeing one in Ethan's office before, tucked into the top drawer of his desk. I knocked lightly, but there was no response. The door was slightly open, so I stepped inside. His office was different from the rest of the house, less curated, more functional. Papers stacked in uneven piles, a coffee mug with a faint ring at the bottom, a jacket draped over the back of a chair. It felt more like him than any other room did. I moved toward the desk and reached for the drawer. As I pulled it open, the laptop on the desk caught my attention. The screen was lit, the cursor blinking in the corner of an open email thread. I did not mean to read it. At least, that is what I told myself at first. But my eyes had already settled on the subject line before I could look away. It mentioned my address in Naperville. I stood there for a moment, then allowed myself to read. The email was between Ethan and Lauren. The tone was calm, practical. They were discussing the house. My house. There were numbers listed, estimated market value, potential listing timelines, tax considerations. It was written the way I used to write reports at work, clear, efficient, detached. There was no question anywhere in the exchange, no suggestion that this was something to be discussed with me. I read it twice, slower the second time. The house came into my mind not as an asset, but as a place. The kitchen window in the morning, the sound of the floorboards, the quiet certainty of knowing it belonged to me. Every memory felt suddenly fragile, as if it had already begun to be repackaged into something else. I closed the laptop carefully. I made sure it rested exactly where it had been before. The drawer remained open beside me, the notepad still inside, but I no longer needed it. For a moment, I stood there in the stillness of that room, feeling something settle into place. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not premature planning or harmless conversation. It was a decision that had begun without me. I left the office as quietly as I had entered, closing the door behind me with the same measured care. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded loosely in my lap. I did not cry. I did not feel the sharp edge of anger I might have expected. What I felt was steadier than that. A kind of clarity. I had spent weeks telling myself that I was adjusting, that this was temporary, that everything would return to its proper shape in time. But now, for the first time, I allowed myself to see it without that reassurance. I was no longer being included in the decisions that defined my life, and that was not something that had happened all at once. It had been happening quietly, piece by piece, while I stood nearby, believing I was still part of it. If you're beginning to realize just how deep this situation goes, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. I did not confront them right away. That surprised me at first. The absence of urgency, the lack of impulse to demand an explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood why. A reaction would have given them control over the direction of the conversation. I was not ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I carried what I had seen with me, letting it settle into something solid and usable. That evening, we sat in the kitchen together, the three of us moving through a familiar routine. Lauren was preparing something light for dinner, Ethan scrolling through his phone between bites, the quiet hum of the house filling the spaces between us. I chose my moment carefully, not wanting to disrupt the balance too abruptly. I asked about the house in Naperville, in a tone that matched the setting, casual enough to seem unremarkable. Ethan looked up briefly, then back down again. He said they had been thinking about what made the most sense long term, about how it might be easier if things were simplified. The words came out smoothly, but there was something practiced in the way he said them, as if he had already gone over this explanation before. Lauren stepped in without hesitation. She spoke about planning ahead, about reducing stress, about making sure everything was handled before it became complicated. Her voice was steady, confident, the voice of someone used to organizing outcomes. Neither of them asked what I thought. I listened, nodding where it seemed appropriate, keeping my expression neutral. I did not mention the email. I did not point out the absence of my voice in their plans. There was no need. The structure of the conversation made it clear enough. This was not a discussion. It was a direction. Later that night, in the quiet of my room, I began to go through my things. I took out the folder I had brought with me from Naperville, the one that held copies of my property documents, bank information, and insurance papers. I had not looked at it since I arrived. At the time, it had felt unnecessary. Now, it felt essential. I spread everything out on the bed, smoothing each page carefully as I read. The house was still in my name. The accounts were still mine. On paper, nothing had changed. But paper, I knew, only told part of the story. I made a list of everything I needed to confirm. Account access, authorized users, any permissions that might have been granted during my hospital stay. I tried to remember what I had signed, what I had agreed to, in moments when I had been more focused on recovery than details. The next morning, I called my lawyer in Chicago. Her voice was steady, familiar, unchanged by time or distance. I explained only what was necessary, asking her to review my accounts and confirm that everything remained under my control. She did not ask many questions. She did not need to. After the call, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, but alignment. A sense that I was beginning to stand on my own ground again, even if I had not moved from where I was. Over the following days, I continued quietly. I paid attention to what belonged to me, not just in terms of property, but in terms of decision. I began to separate, in my mind, what was mine to choose and what had been gradually taken out of my hands. I did not make any sudden moves. I did not announce any decisions, but something had already begun. If I did nothing, they would continue, and I was no longer willing to let that happen without understanding exactly what still belonged to me. If you can feel that something bigger is about to unfold, comment number 4 below, so I know you're still here. Now let's move on to chapter 5. By the time I chose to speak, I was no longer uncertain. The questions that had lingered in the back of my mind had settled into answers I could no longer ignore. What remained was not confusion, but the need to hear them say it out loud. It happened in the living room one evening. the television on but muted, casting a shifting light across the walls. Lauren was seated with her laptop, reviewing listings, while Ethan leaned back on the couch, scrolling through his phone in the quiet way he often did after work. The room looked calm, almost ordinary. That made what followed feel even more precise. I stood near the doorway for a moment before stepping in. Neither of them noticed me immediately, and I allowed myself that brief second to observe them as they were when they were not aware of being seen. Then I spoke. I asked about the account. Ethan looked up first, his expression changing in a way that suggested he already knew what I meant. Lauren did not look up right away, but I could see her hands pause on the keyboard. I mentioned the transfer. I mentioned the access that had been granted while I was in the hospital. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what I knew, one piece at a time, placing it between us. Ethan sat forward, his posture shifting into something more alert, more guarded. He said it was for my protection, that they were trying to make sure everything was taken care of in case something happened again. His words came quickly, as if speed might make them more convincing. Lauren closed her laptop then and looked directly at me. There was no hesitation in her expression, no attempt to soften what she was about to say. She spoke in the same measured tone she used when explaining contracts to clients. She said I could not manage everything on my own anymore. There was no cruelty in her voice. That was what made it land the way it did. It was not meant to hurt. It was meant to define. I felt something settle inside me, not breaking, but aligning. A final piece falling into place. Ethan continued speaking, trying to bridge the space that had opened. He talked about responsibility, about making things easier, about not wanting me to worry. But the words no longer held the same weight. I could hear the intention beneath them now, the assumption that had already taken root. They were not asking for my trust. They had already moved past that point. I listened without interrupting. I let them explain, justify, reframe. Each sentence added to the picture that had been forming quietly over the past weeks. This was not a temporary adjustment or a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a conversation. This was a shift in how they saw me. I was no longer someone who made decisions. I was someone decisions were made for. The realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of stillness that made everything else feel distant. I looked at Ethan and saw not the boy I had raised, but a man who had convinced himself he was doing the right thing without ever asking if it was his place to decide. I looked at Lauren and understood that, in her world, control and care were not separate ideas. When the room fell quiet again, I did not fill the space. There was nothing left to clarify. They had already decided who I was, and now, for the first time, I was ready to decide what I would do about it. That night, I did not turn on the lights right away. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dim outline of the room, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt uncertain. The silence had changed. It no longer asked anything of me. It simply existed, and within it, so did I. I replayed the conversation from earlier, not to examine it, but to understand what it had confirmed. There had been no hesitation in Lauren's voice, no doubt in Ethan's reasoning. What they believed had already settled into place long before I chose to speak. I had not lost an argument. I had been reassigned a role. The distinction mattered. I leaned back slightly, resting my hands against the mattress, and allowed myself to think not about what had happened, but about what would come next if nothing changed. I imagined the weeks ahead, then the months. More conversations where decisions were presented instead of discussed. More quiet adjustments made on my behalf. More moments where I would be expected to accept what had already been decided. It was not difficult to see the direction it would take. What unsettled me was not the idea of losing money or property. Those were things I understood how to manage, how to recover, how to rebuild if necessary. What unsettled me was the gradual removal of my voice from my own life. I had spent decades building a life where I answered to no one in that way. I had made decisions, taken responsibility, and accepted the consequences that came with both. That had not changed simply because I had needed help for a short period of time. Yet somewhere along the way, that version of me had been quietly replaced. I stood then, finally turning on the light. The room came into focus, familiar and contained, but no longer enough. I moved to the dresser and opened the drawer where I kept my documents. I did not hesitate this time. I did not question whether I was overreacting or misreading anything. Clarity had removed that uncertainty. The next morning, I began. I called the bank first. I asked them to review the account access and to remove any secondary permissions that had been added. I listened carefully as they confirmed the changes, noting each detail, each step completed. There was no resistance, no complication. The control had always been mine. I had simply allowed it to be shared. After that, I contacted my lawyer again. This time, I was more direct. I asked her to ensure that every asset, every account, every legal document reflected exactly what I intended moving forward. She understood immediately. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness in it that matched my own. By midday, I had moved from reaction to structure. In the afternoon, I began looking for places to go. Not temporary arrangements, not something dependent on anyone else, something that belonged entirely to me. It did not take long before I found it. A small community in Sedona, Arizona, designed for independent living, quiet, self-contained, intentional. I studied the details carefully, reading through everything twice. It was not about escape, it was about placement. By the time evening came, I had made my decision fully. I would leave. Not in anger, not in haste, but with the same care I had used to build everything else in my life. This time, I did not ask for permission. If you understand why this decision changes everything, comment number 6 below to let me know you're still with me. Now let's move on to chapter 7. I did not leave immediately after making the decision. There was no urgency in it, no need to rush. What I was doing required clarity, not speed. I waited for the right moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted the act itself to be clean, uninterrupted, and entirely my own. That moment came a few days later when Ethan and Lauren left for a work trip. Sophie was staying with a friend for the weekend. The house, for the first time since I had arrived, belonged only to silence. I stood in the kitchen that morning for a while, taking in the stillness. It did not feel tense anymore. Without their presence, the space lost the quiet pressure I had grown used to. It was just a house again, neutral, unclaimed. I began with the practical things. Documents first. I gathered every paper that mattered, each one checked and placed carefully into a folder. Property records, bank information, identification. Things that defined ownership, things that ensured nothing about me could be rewritten without my consent. Then I moved on to my belongings. I was deliberate about what I took. If something was unquestionably mine, it went into a box. If there was any doubt, I left it behind. I had no interest in carrying anything that required explanation. This was not about taking from them. It was about reclaiming what was already mine. Clothes, books, a few personal items that held meaning beyond their use. Each object I packed felt less like removal and more like restoration. Piece by piece, I gathered the parts of my life that had been quietly absorbed into theirs. The house remained orderly as I moved through it. I wiped down surfaces I had used, returned small things to their places. not out of obligation, but because that was how I had always done things. Leaving did not change that. When everything was packed, I sat down at the kitchen table and began to write. The letter took time, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted each word to be exact. I did not write in anger. I did not write to accuse. I wrote to state what was true. I told Ethan that I knew about the account, about the transfer, about the plans that had been made without me. I told him I understood what it meant, not as a single decision, but as a pattern of thinking that had already taken hold. I made it clear that I was not leaving because I was hurt in a moment. I was leaving because I would not allow that pattern to continue. I wrote that I was still capable of making my own decisions, that I had been doing so long before he had a life of his own, that needing help for a brief time did not erase everything I had built. I told him where I was going, not as a request, but as information. He could choose what to do with it. When I finished, I read it once more, then folded it neatly and placed it in the center of the table where he would not miss it. The final steps were simple. I carried my boxes to the car one at a time. The air outside was still, the sky clear in a way that made everything feel sharper. When the last box was loaded, I went back inside and stood for a moment in the entryway. I did not search for meaning in the walls or the rooms. That had already been done. I locked the door behind me and left the key where they would find it. Then I walked to my car, got in, and drove away. I did not look back. I had already left before I walked out. The drive to Sedona took most of the day, and I did not rush it. I left Austin early before the roads filled, before the day had fully decided what it would become. The city faded behind me gradually, replaced by long stretches of highway that seemed to pull everything forward in a steady, uninterrupted line. I kept the radio off. Silence felt more appropriate, as if anything else would interfere with what was already settling into place. As the miles passed, the landscape began to change. Buildings gave way to open land, then to something more expansive, more exposed. The sky stretched wider than I was used to, the horizon less defined. By the time the red rock formations appeared in the distance, I felt a shift that had nothing to do with geography. I was no longer leaving. I was arriving. Sedona did not announce itself loudly. It existed with a kind of quiet certainty, as if it had no need to impress anyone. The air felt different when I stepped out of the car, thinner, cleaner, carrying a stillness that did not feel empty. It felt intentional. The community I had chosen was modest, just as I expected. Small homes spaced with enough distance to allow privacy, paths that curved naturally instead of forcing direction. There was no sense of intrusion, no pressure to belong immediately. My house was simple. One level, clean lines, nothing unnecessary. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space greeted me without expectation. It did not ask me to adjust myself to fit it. It waited. I brought in the first box and set it down in the center of the room. For a moment, I stood there, taking in the quiet. It was different from the silence I had left behind. This one did not carry tension or observation. It did not feel like something I had to move carefully within. It belonged to me. I unpacked slowly over the next few hours. There was no need to finish everything at once. Each item I placed had its own time, its own purpose. I arranged the kitchen first, then the bedroom, then the small living space. I did not follow any pattern except my own. That evening, I made a simple meal and sat at the table with no one across from me. The absence did not feel like loss. It felt like space. The next morning, I stepped outside just after sunrise. The light moved differently here, softer but more direct, casting long shadows that shifted with the hour. A woman from the neighboring house passed by and gave a small nod. It was not an invitation, not a question, just an acknowledgement. It was enough. I began to establish a routine without thinking too much about it. Short walks in the morning, organizing the rest of my things, preparing meals that suited only me. There was no need to coordinate, no need to anticipate anyone else's preferences. My phone had been quiet during the drive, but by the second day, the messages began to appear. Missed calls, short texts, each one carrying a different tone. I read them, but I did not respond immediately. When I finally answered, it was because I chose to. Ethan's voice was careful, measured in a way I had not heard before. He apologized, not with certainty, but with an understanding that he was trying to reach. I listened. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I told him I understood what he was saying, but understanding did not mean returning. When the call ended, I set the phone down and looked around the room. The light had shifted again, moving across the floor in a slow, deliberate pattern. There was no noise, no expectation, no adjustment required. For the first time in a long while, everything around me answered only to me, and that was enough. If you can feel that we are getting close to the truth behind everything, comment number 8 below to stay with me. Now, let's move on to the final part of the story. By the time Ethan asked to visit, nearly 3 weeks had passed since I arrived in Sedona. Time moved differently here, not slower exactly, but with less resistance. My days had settled into a rhythm that did not require adjustment. I woke early, walked along the quiet paths that curved through the community, returned home to make breakfast, and spent the rest of the day arranging, reading, or simply sitting in the kind of stillness that no longer felt unfamiliar. I had not thought much about whether I missed my old life. That question seemed less important than it once had. What mattered was that I no longer felt displaced within my own days. Ethan's messages had changed over time. At first, they carried urgency, confusion, a need to understand what had happened. Then they became quieter, more measured. Fewer explanations, more acknowledgement. When he finally asked if he could come to see me, I did not answer right away. When I did, I kept it simple. He arrived 2 days later, alone. I noticed that immediately. There was something in that choice that spoke more clearly than anything he might have said. When I opened the door, he stood there for a moment, as if uncertain whether to step forward or wait to be invited. I stepped aside and let him in. He looked different, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. There was less assumption in his posture, less certainty in his movements. He took in the room slowly, his eyes moving across the shelves, the table, the way I had arranged everything. "It suits you," he said. I nodded, but did not respond beyond that. We sat across from each other at the table. The space between us felt defined, not uncomfortable, just clear. He began speaking carefully, choosing his words with a kind of deliberation I had not seen in him before. He said he had been thinking, that he had not realized how far things had gone, that he should have spoken to me instead of around me. I listened without interrupting. There was no need to correct him or guide the conversation. What he was saying was not new to me. It was simply something he was now able to say out loud. He did not make excuses. That mattered more than anything else. When he finished, the room was quiet again. I looked at him for a moment, not searching for the boy I had raised, but seeing the man in front of me as he was now. I told him I understood what he was trying to say, and I did. But understanding did not erase what had happened. It did not return things to what they had been, and I did not expect it to. Some shifts do not reverse. They settle into something else. We spoke for a while longer, about practical things, about the house in Naperville, about what would happen next. The conversation remained steady, contained within the boundaries that had been drawn. When he stood to leave, he hesitated slightly, then stepped forward and embraced me. It was not rushed. It was not performative. It was something closer to recognition. After he left, I stood by the door for a moment, then walked back into the house. The light had shifted across the floor, settling into the corners of the room in a way that felt familiar now. Nothing felt unsettled. What remained between us was not what it had been before, but it was something clearer, and for the first time that felt enough. By the time spring began to settle into the desert, I no longer measured my days by what I had left behind. The routines I had built in Sedona had become something more than structure. They had become a way of living that did not require adjustment or negotiation. Each morning, I walked the same path as the sun rose over the red rock formations, watching the light shift slowly across the landscape. It was not repetitive, it was steady. I began teaching a small financial literacy class twice a week at the community center. It started simply, a conversation with a neighbor who mentioned she did not fully understand her own accounts. That conversation turned into another, and then a small group formed. I showed them how to read statements, how to recognize control, how to ask the right questions before signing anything. It was not the same as the work I had done before, but it carried the same purpose. I was helping people understand what belonged to them and how to keep it that way. In doing so, I understood something about myself as well. I had not lost my independence when I moved to Austin. I had only stepped away from it temporarily, believing it would still be there, unchanged, when I returned. What I had not accounted for was how easily it could be redefined by others if I did not actively protect it. Ethan and I spoke occasionally. Our conversations were measured, respectful, without the assumptions that had once filled the space between us. He no longer tried to guide or manage. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, there was a care in his words that had not been there before. Sophie began reaching out in small ways. A message here, a question there. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced. But there was a curiosity in her now, a quiet willingness to see me as something more than a background presence. Lauren remained absent from those conversations. I did not ask about her, and Ethan did not offer much. What I knew was enough. Some consequences unfold without needing to be witnessed directly. I spent more time outside as the weather warmed. Near the edge of my small yard, a cluster of desert plants had taken root, their shapes unfamiliar at first, their resilience easy to overlook. They did not require much. They did not depend on careful tending. And yet, they endured. I found myself drawn to them in a way I had not expected. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition or reassurance. It simply continues, quietly, on its own terms. I had spent a long time believing that making room for others was the same as doing what was right. I understand now that space must be balanced, that what you allow can become what defines you if you are not careful. I did not leave to prove anything. I left because I understood finally that my life was still mine to choose, and this time I chose to keep it. In the end, what truly matters is not what we lose, but what we are willing to reclaim. Life has a quiet way of testing our sense of worth, especially when time, circumstance, or even the people closest to us begin to redefine who we are. But dignity is not something that fades with age, and independence is not something that should be handed over simply because it is easier for others to take control. There comes a moment when silence is no longer strength, and choosing yourself becomes the most honest act of all. Growth does not always come from holding on. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to walk away and rebuild on your own terms. If this story resonated with you, thank you for staying until the end. Feel free to share your thoughts, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.